Namaste. Before we begin, a short prayer unto Lord Rama. Namostu Ramaya Salakshmanaya Devyai Chatasya Janakatmajayai Namostu Rudra Indra Yamanilebhyo Namostu Chandrarka Marutganebhyaha. Today, we are into the 6th week of our course on sense of past towards realizing Rama Rājya. One of the things that I did indicate in my mails to this group is that in the days to come, we shall find several claims to what Rama Rājya is. And it is something that we are indeed going to see it happen quite often because of the construction of the Rama Mandira in Ayodhya. So it indeed is important that we try and gain our own understanding about what it means to talk of Rama Rājya, and with all the necessary conditions of where we are currently, and if in case there is a consensus that gets built, is there a better consensus towards which we as a collective can imagine and strive for? So this is a point where I also intend to bring to your attention that recently I happened to take a look at a book which is titled Swaraj Se Rama Rājya Tak, which is written by Sri K.N. Govindacharya. And the manner in which this book is written is something that you could say is an agenda that can be taken up right away. It is in that format that the book has been formulated, and it does include all the major aspects that one would expect. The formulation of aspects which are relating to dharma that have been in the public space over the past 70 to 80 years. So what are these things? So it does speak about the cow protection. It speaks about Ganga. It speaks about the formulation of a uniform civil code, which are some of the aspects that you would find. And also the point about how best can we work out panchayats and panchayati raj system. So the directive principles of state policy that are listed in the Constitution of India, how far have they been brought to implementation, and how well can we move further in the light of the Swarajya that we obtained on the 15th of August 1947 Common Era, and which has been, say, reinforced in a true manner by the way in which India became a republic in the modern sense of the term independence. So given this this kind of activity, we indeed require to say look at some of the fundamental questions which have been left open, or rather say not taken directly for reflection, as in the kind of points that are existent in the debates between Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar, some of which I brought to your attention in the previous sessions. This week, the theme is titled Sanatana as Nitya Nutana, and there is a specific reason why it is formulated thus. So I shall bring to your attention in what manner we can understand this sense of Sanatanata and what is Sanatana as well. And at the same time, it is equally important to speak a little about the sense of Sanatana Dharma. And we would notice that insofar as several of Arsha Vakyas that are available to us from our own Sanskrit tradition, there is a whole number of shlokas which actually specify Esha Dharma Sanatanaha. So this Esha Dharma Sanatanaha formulation, and correspondingly wherever there is a specific mention about Dharma Sanatanaha that one notices, we'll actually come across a very fine formulation that requires to be, say, indeed explored. So I intend to begin by pointing you to a few shlokas. These are from the Shanti Parva, where Bhishmacharya is instructing Yudhishthira about Rajadharma. And there is a point at which I did bring to your attention that when we have to speak of a Rama Rājya today, there indeed is a requirement to have a sense of what Raja is. And for that to happen, we need to get a sense of the nature of Raja as distinct from what we find as the sovereign in the current state. So these are questions that are necessarily to be addressed. And the other point that also requires to be noted is that when it comes to the question of what is Sanatana, and when one looks at the nature of meanings that are accorded to Sanatana, Sanatana as Nitya is something that we get from all koshas. So Amara Kosha would give Nitya and Sanatana, Sadatana as all synonymous words. So question for us today is that in what manner shall we take up the question of Nutanatva as added on to the focus in Nityatva of Sanatanata. So this is a point that we shall deliberate on. And the other point that I also want to bring to your attention is there are certain things which if we are to claim is Sanatana, which also means Sasvata, which is permanent, that which is eternal, that which does not have any kinds of time-space necessary. It does not actually have constraints of time and space. So these are the senses in which the term Sanatana is understood, and it is something which requires due reflection as well. And the sense of dharma in itself, if it is properly understood, then if one looks at the nature of what it means to talk of Sanatana Dharma, specifically in the context of kingdoms, then we have, say, a very interesting assertion that Bhishmacharya makes. I am reading out this shloka for your attention. I could possibly also share the this screen with you. Nayasya kuta kapatam na maya na cha matsaraha vishaye bhumi palasya tasya dharma sanatanaha. So the reference that is being given is, if one were to understand Sanatana Dharma in the context of a Rajya and in the context of a Raja, then what one requires to measure is, in that Rajya or in that reign of a Raja where one does not find Kuta Kapata. So there is no sense by which one takes to anything that has to do with deception, nor something that requires to be concealed. Na Maya, where one does not require to create an illusory or a delusory scenario. Nacha Matsaraha, nor there is envy. So, if at all there exists a Raja where none of these conditions are to be found, then that dharma which is actually operative in the Rajya of such a Raja is Sanatana Dharma. So that's a fairly, say, comprehensive formulation, which can as well be reflected on by actually taking up what kind of systems. I mean, if one were to look at a constructive approach of how to look at polities and the nature of polities that are to be imagined, these are the grounds that can be kept as the parameters surrounding which, if one were to imagine a theorization of the nature of polity, then the claim could as well be made that such a kind of a polity shall lead to a polity with Chaturvarnya and with Varnashrama Dharma. So that is a formulation which can be shown. So for the time being, my focus is not to bring that out, but to bring this to your attention that if one were to speak of Rama Rājya, then apart from the specific kind of special qualities that we've already discussed are part of Rama Rājya, and the kind of praise that one finds of Rama Rājya, since Rama Rājya is expected to have had Sanatana Dharma in force, it also had these aspects necessarily in place. Nayasya Kuta Kapatam, Namaya Nacha Matsaraha. While this is on one side, there are quite a few shlokas where one finds, say, Dharma Sanatanaha, Esha Dharma Sanatanaha formulations that one does find across various aspects. I've only collected a few. So if one is interested in, say, the formulation of how does one take the term Sanatana in the context of polity and the nature of Rajya, it's a very fine exercise to look at. To start with, say, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute's the critical edition of Mahabharata, which with all its flaws, we still have, say, the entire text of it, which is put up online. So you just require to, say, search for the term Sanatana and try to pick up all the shlokas and try to see in what context it is being brought to one's own attention. Now, the other point that I wanted to bring in, right before, say, I mean, a few shlokas before, there is a statement in the same 57th Adhyaya, where Bhishmacharya tells Yudhishthira, Chaturvarnyascha dharmascha rakshitavya mahikshita dharmasankara rakshahi ragyam dharma sanatanaha. So the Sanatana Dharma of a Raja is to ensure that there is a protection of dharma from Sankarata. We've actually come across this term Sankara and Sankarya in the context of Swarajin ideas, and that is something that we'll indeed have to pay sufficient attention, because in the previous session of mine, I have brought to your attention that the manner in which Dr. Ambedkar has formulated the annihilation of caste is that since Rama as a Raja is certainly someone who follows the law by all means and enforces it without any kind of a error, he'll go to the extent of suffering for the cause of ensuring that the law is enforced. We do have a requirement of such a person at the helm of affairs, but the nature of the kind of law that is operative should not be what it is what was the argument that Dr. Ambedkar makes, and he further says that what requires to be worked out in current times is the embrace of the modern abstract ideas that have taken their birth in French Revolution, that include liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice in that framework. So these are terms which we have also come across as present in our preamble of the Constitution of India. And our own senses of what these shall mean is a question that hasn't been given due importance. And we are actually, say, benefited also by some of the very insightful critiques of what happened in French Revolution by some of the very thinking leaders of modern times, that include someone like Alexander Solzhenitsyn of the Soviet Russia. And he has made a very important observation that if one indeed were to be truly talking of equality, not in the sense of its spirit, but in terms of its actual practice, then necessarily one would have to, any one person would have to be ready to forego their liberty. So there are tensions which are inherently observed between these values that are actually proposed. And since they are abstract, they are actually, the tension between them is what the modern polity would say is what would actually lead us to striking of an appropriate balance. That would indeed be the kind of an utopia that requires to be striven towards. And how do you ensure that, say, this be achieved? So Dr. Ambedkar's suggestion is that the only way in which one can do away, in the case of the Hindu society, for one to move beyond where we are, where there is a strong affinity as well as respect for Shastras, is that unless they are shunned, you cannot embrace these values as liberty, equality, fraternity. There is a counter to it, which has also been given from within the fold of those who believe these Shastras. We'll also look at that response, because I gave it in brief by referring to simple equality and complex equality in a previous session. We'd actually try to, say, elaborate on that a bit more. But more importantly, if one were to take the sense of the terms that Professor K.C. Bhattacharya has specifically brought to our attention regarding confusion and the sense of conflict between ideas. So the clarification that one can obtain post the clarity that one has, and when there is no confusion, that is when proper conflict builds. So amongst the people who have observed the kind of strong conflict that exists between these set of values and the set of values that are present, that are inherited as part of the Hindu society and its embrace of Varnashrama Dharma, necessarily created certain kinds of structures for it to be in place. And that is where the response to try and bring this to a close was found by pointing out that because caste as a structure is a mixture of endogamy and exogamy, and these are this is a definition given by Dr. Ambedkar himself in one of his early thesis that he did while studying at Columbia University. So one is that there is a endogamy with respect to varna and an exogamy with respect to gotra. So such a thing creates the caste structure as is right now. And a person who is born into a varna remains in that varna throughout his life. And that would indeed mean that the kind of desired sense of having a graduation to a higher varna within this birth is not possible as per Varnashrama Dharma in the Shastra. And this was unacceptable to Dr. Ambedkar because it is inherently hierarchical, and this inherent hierarchy can indeed turn out to be oppressive. And this is the kind of a point that we find across the world today in the discussion with respect to the sense of understanding of Varnashrama Dharma by pointing it and contrasting with the practice of untouchability as has been brought to the attention earlier. So we have a very important case in here where on one side there is a strong conflict that is present in those people who intend to follow what they seek is what they have inherited. And on the other, there are these values which are found to be quite attractive in liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. And the practice of untouchability, as has been, say, noticed and also has been specifically abolished under the Constitution of India, it gave a very clear direction that says that unless and until one can avoid the kind of conditions under which untouchability can be removed, or a practice of it can be removed, there is no way in which a Hindu society can think of these values. And this is a categorical analysis that Dr. Ambedkar does. And his suggestion is that the way in which this can be achieved is by ensuring that there is, say, no bars on the manner of marriages between people. So intercaste marriages are the first way to ensure that these kind of hierarchies and these kind of divisions which are present in the Hindu society can be removed. So such is the kind of a formulation that Dr. Ambedkar has presented. Now, the key point in this formulation at its core lies a certain kind of a belief. And that belief is this, that insofar as any individual is concerned, any individual can be doing any kind of a work, and the eligibility to do any type of work is present inherently in any human being. So there is no way in which one can categorize people upfront about what a person can do. So everyone has eligibility, as well as everyone has adhikara to do anything as they think is appropriate to them. Now, this is a principle which at one plane sounds very attractive because it does not have any sense of restraint on any person. And the only condition that one may pose would be that a person would have to strive to be suitable to undertake the kind of task that one may actually choose to take up. And clearly, you may notice that this would go and violate the formulation that Gitacharya mentioned when he says, Swadharme nidhanam sreyaha paradharmo bhayavaha. What it means is a person who considers a specific task as his own dharma, as recognized by his swa, which we'll have to also understand what this swa would be. It is better for a person to die performing his own swadharma, even if he were excellent in performing somebody else's dharma, paradharma, because that is bhayavaha. That is actually something that creates a definite sense of imbalance, and thereby a sense of fear of disorder is imminent. So this is indeed a point of deep conflict that requires due attention for us in the context of discussing Rama Rājya in the present, and necessarily, unless there is a clarity about this aspect, one cannot possibly talk about the way forward on Rama Rājya. There are ways and means by which some people would like to bypass this. So I'd also tell you what is the bypass route which is actually suggested. The suggestion would be that let us not actually get this, or rather say push it to that sense when it indeed turns out as a conflict. It can as well be, say, avoided if there are people, those who strongly believe in this formulation of their own inheritance and of their own kind. Let them not actually make a very strong point of it. Let them follow it in private, and let them do it in their own manner. And let it be that, say, they do not try to assert themselves in the public space. So this is a kind of a formulation which has indeed been practiced by several people in the past 70 odd years. And this is not something that I am formulating for myself or for the sake of formulation. There indeed have been a number of people who said that these are possibly times which are not conducive for this idea. So therefore, say, we shall do it in private, and let us not speak of it. Let us not try to, say, in any manner, see this as a case where one has to assert oneself. So to this extent, say, there is a certain kind of a formulation which has come about. And this also meant that if in case there is any kind of an effort that can be done to ensure that this sense of intermixing of the senses in which one carries. So there are, say, measures by which you would find an entire narrative of the idea of India that gets built when it comes to certain kinds of narratives, where one would point out that there are DNA studies in the country that will indeed show that all Indians trace their genes to two possible, say, strands, which they would call as ancient North Indian strand and ancient South Indian strand. And it has also been observed that as feared by, say, Arjuna in the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that there indeed has been a lot of intermixing or Varna Sankarya that happened, and that has been identified in terms of the DNA samples which have been looked at by people. And that goes back to, say, around 4,000 years from now, that is around 2000 BCE or so. There has been such a kind of intermixing that took place in the past, in our collective past. So therefore, say, to speak of any sense of pure Varna today is something that doesn't make meaningful sense. We have all been people who have been interacting, and therefore say we are indeed having say marriages and the kind of ways and means by which different cultures, when they encounter these kind of things, indeed keep happening. So these kind of formulations are brought to picture. Whereas after some time, I mean 4,000 years ago this happened, and maybe around say the 4th, 3rd to 5th century in the Common Era, again there has been a kind of effort, conscious effort made by the then rulers, which rigidified the earlier fluid society where there was a great degree of intermixing that happened. And this rigidity has resulted in the kind of various silos that exist in terms of the various castes that we notice today. So this is one formulation about the manner in which Indian society is to be understood. And they further say that what happened 4,000 years ago is something that is better to happen even right now. And that is something that we should embrace, because the manner in which, say, the formulation of the kind of a desire for equality and the desire for an egalitarian society, that shall be rapidly, say, brought forth when this kind of a thing becomes a reality. So this is the argument in crux. So this question, if you are conscious about, say, looking at it carefully, is also one of the key kinds of conflicts that one finds not just in India, but across the board, across the world. And the senses in which, say, the manner in which this becomes a conflict, it can happen, say, it can actually find its say, expression in different ways. But the form at its root would point out to the key question of how exactly can the manner in which one can think of a relationship between a man and a woman be solemnized in a manner in which they can indeed procreate. So this is a crux of the question. Today, of course, say, apart from man and a woman, people indeed would like to add a few more, say, say, versions of it, where they would say that to speak of a gender prior to the conscious knowledge of a person itself is something which is a conditioning, and societies should not be conditioning any kind of a person, and people should have a freedom to try and choose what kind of gender they believe to be. So these are certain kind of formulations that we do get to hear. It's a different story that these kind of arguments are not being made for the first time right now, though of course the form of these arguments has been present not just now, but probably, say, across generations. These arguments may take, the content of it might alter, but the form of it remains the same. So even, say, 100 years ago, an argument of this kind was indeed posed, and that was actually in the context of the embrace of democracy in different parts of the world. So how at all will the idea that each person is indeed, say, to be considered as enjoying the sense of sovereignty, how could you actually create that? Well, there is a day in which, say, each person exercises their right to vote, and because they have this right to vote, that gives them a political identity, and with the way in which they exercise this vote, and also that after 5 years you create another election, or say after a certain degree of time, there is a possibility of one to revoke whatever is the choice that you have made earlier. So this sense of sovereignty that is vested in the individual, when it is coalesced across the entire society, it grows into, say, great strength, and that strength is what we are actually talking of as the sense of the popular sovereignty today. So this sense, for it to get exercised in practice, how would one actually make a decision of deciding on what kind of a candidate should I vote for? What would be the kind of policy that I should vote for, that I should prefer? This is a political choice for which, say, an individual is to be aware of what kind of things he ought to be choosing and he ought not to be choosing, depending, of course, based on, say, whatever are the inherent likes, dislikes, or inherent capacity for grasping what is the state of affairs. So where exactly does one get this? So there's a very fine kind of an excerpt, which was from one of the books that I did refer to in my previous sessions, which got translated to Hindi by Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao. I'm referring to a book called Sahasrapana in Hindi, where there's a very interesting conversation between editor of a newspaper and one of the reporters who recently joined the place. So there was, because, say, this is a newspaper which was indeed interested in developing the spirit of democracy in people, it invited, say, write-ups from common people, and many people who aren't yet used to, say, writing articles. They sent a number of articles, and these articles, when they actually reached the editor, so the newly joined reporter was actually assisting this chief editor in terms of editing these, because the newly joined editor was actually a Telugu Pandit. So in this case, it would be a Hindi Pandit. So therefore, say, he was looking at the kind of write-ups which have been received, most of which did not have grammatical roots followed, nor did they have the ideas which are actually properly articulated for it to be conveyed across to someone else. So the editor, when speaking to all the people, whoever have submitted, he said, ours is a magazine, ours is a newspaper which is for the people and by the people. So we are of the people as well. So therefore, whatever you say is what gets published. So this is the kind of a talk that came in. So after listening to this wonderful speech, the newly joined employee, he asked, so should we mean that, say, we publish these as is? So then the editor comes and says, you see, if you do that, then our circulation will fall, because there are indeed other people who are necessarily the case that they are more educated. So do one thing, correct everything in manner in which, say, it conveys a reasonable argument, but the argument must be such that the sense of a democracy must indeed be upheld, that people are indeed in power. So that sense must get conveyed. So for it to get conveyed is what our interest is, and we'll indeed make these editing and then publish it. So then this man who has just joined, he actually felt that, say, this is something that is really a problematic thing for him, because he felt, I intend to be honest about what my job is. This task seemed to be as good as saying that I need to lower my threshold of honesty. So he said, I cannot do this. So then the editor said, you see, you don't seem to understand the ways of the new world. It does indeed call for us to state one thing in public, and when we actually comes to, say, the manner in which this is brought to force, it must be something else. So this story is a glimpse of, say, the manner in which a certain kind of an agenda can get pushed forth through the medium by which it is conveyed. And this is a point which is very important for all senses of democratic polity across the world. So today, of course, we'll have a more complicated, more sophisticated approach by which, say, people might claim the kind of influence of Facebook or Google in terms of the kind of impact that it has on democracies, etc. But all of which are done within the scope of pointing out that the sense of democracy is the best form of polity that can ever exist. And what is the sense of this democratic polity? It necessarily has to be an electoral polity. And that electoral polity, again, must be of that nature that it gives us a point of accountability, which is given a greater importance than a sense of permanence. So why am I bringing this point out? You see, one of the recent suggestions that you find our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi went around making is that because of the kind of elections across the country at all times, whether it be with respect to the local body elections or state elections or union elections, and spread across 29 states, we are always in an electoral mode. So it doesn't give sufficient space for collective action to ensure that there is good governance. So it is important that we need to start thinking about how we can have fixed kind of slots where there are uniform elections held across the board, across the country, for all kinds of bodies to which elections are to be held. Now, if one actually focuses on this, then a point that indeed gets coupled with, one indeed takes this idea seriously, then we might as well notice a requirement that, say, there will be a greater focus on trying to give permanent 5 years to a person who gets elected for the parliament. And it is only then that can you ensure that once you have fixed uniform elections, that uniform elections keep getting conducted across the board. So there was a choice that was made during the Constituent Assembly debates itself, whether we should go for, say, an accountability or permanence. So the accountability factor was chosen over, say, permanence, because it was felt that any government, when it cannot actually command the majority of the House of People, it has to step down. So this is what actually is the case where we find today's instance of different kinds of times for different kinds of states or the union elections falling in different, or rather say, falling one after another continuously. If you had a very fixed mandate that you are going to be in power for so many years, then that would indeed make people who have now come to power, they would be in a position to start thinking about governance, which otherwise has been, say, forced to be set aside because you are always in an election mode or an electoral mode. Now, there is a connected idea which also comes from the theories of democratic polity also that are to be understood. One would go back to, say, the origins of the separation of powers into legislature, executive, judiciary, that also are actually very important in this formulation, because sovereignty itself has now been, say, distributed amongst these bodies. So President of India is the head of the state, and he is nominal authority, and through him, whatever is the kind of power that is accrued to him, which is passed on by the individual sovereignties that each individual citizen of the country who is eligible, that is, who is above the age of 18, when they happen to vote, they transfer a part of their sovereignty, which all accrues together, and that is now vested into the seat of the President of India. So this is the way in which we find the modern democratic theory function. So from there, it actually gets devolved into legislature, executive, and judiciary. And each is supposed to have checks and balances with respect to the other organ. That is what is the current way in which the polity has been imagined. But when the discussion about democracies itself happened in France, that was during and prior to the French Revolution itself, there are quite a few, say, analysis that were done, and one can also go back to Plato and his disregard for the sense of democracy, because a person who is part of electoral democracy, who is representing people, what is the kind of ownership that the person who is representing people have over the territory or the constituency in which he is the representative? A modern democracy would say that one cannot claim that you are an owner of anything. Notice that a Raja would claim ownership of the entire Rajya. So this is a very key insight, which say is a problem which is present in modern democratic theory. But when it comes to, say, people who are necessarily, say, successful politicians, they would never behave in the manner in which the theory of this democratic polity speaks of. They would indeed assume that they are kings. They are actually the ones who are holding the entire sovereignty. In fact, I was fortunate to listen to some of these stories where in one of the constituencies there's an MLA who would say that if at all you intend to start a shop in his constituency, then you need to ensure that there is a tribute that needs to be paid to him. One may call this as local tax that the MLA is charging for himself. But tax would mean that, say, it is a constitutionally legitimate kind of a point, but this is not legitimate. It is something to exercise the influence of the power of the person. So if you are entering into a fresh constituency, let's say you have a business and you intend to start a outlet of yours in another constituency, then you need to ensure that your business is not troubled by the people who are in power. And those who are in power expect that in order to get protection from them, you pay a tribute to them. And this is not what you expect in a democratic polity. I'll give another example also. This is something that I got to hear quite recently, and also which sits well with the question of the points that we have to discuss today. So this is with respect to Panchayati Raj elections that were recently held in Andhra Pradesh. I suppose more or less similar kind of scenarios would replicate themselves elsewhere. So the story that I got to hear is that you might have noticed in newspapers where they indicate that there are so many different panchayats in which the elections have been unanimous. So unanimously, say, a person got elected as the sarpanch of the panchayat. So what is this story behind the unanimity that came about? So I came to learn that what happens on ground is that there is an auction held between differing parties for the panchayat elections of a place. And why is the auction held? So there's a story behind it. And that is, imagine a village has around 500 households, and all kinds of modern amenities are also to be brought to the enjoyment of people in a rural household as well. This is a kind of desire that is actually expressed as part of the national vision And that is also something that is started since, of course, India becoming a republic. So India's embrace of modern development indeed meant that whatever are the amenities that people would enjoy in the cities are also to be available in the rural areas. So I'm talking about a village where there are around 500 households, and there is a case that is clearly meant where one of the modern kinds of facilities that one finds in a city is that every household gets municipal water. So you need to have panchayat water supplied to every household. That would mean laying of pipes and a construction of a water tank from which, say, there will be supply that is provided across the households. And we also have a case where clearly the manner in which these households which are actually to be received to supply water would mean that one would have to have electricity that is also provided. And if one indeed were to ensure that the electricity costs also are taken into account, then we are actually placed with a case where the costs of electricity and what the people can pay to repay the kind of cost that is actually to be realized, the cost that is realized from this, that needs to be matched for it to be a workable solution or a viable solution. So it turned out that some of the villages have electricity dues to the electricity department that run into a few lakhs of rupees. So 5 lakh rupees, 10 lakh rupees, 15 lakh rupees at least at times. So a person who is standing for the panchayat elections, they would bid saying that I am going to pay 25 lakhs to become the panchayat sarpanch. And there'll be a competition since it's an auction. So somewhere whoever bids highest, he'll be declared as the unanimous winner. And the manner in which this unanimous winner comes about, he has a specific kind of a task. And that is that while the auction goes on, he indicates clearly, so and so amount shall be ensured that whatever are our dues with respect to our village, they shall be paid back. So what is the sense in which, say, this panchayat sarpanch elections have turned out to be? It's a manner in which we clearly see that the person who is contesting, he is bringing to the people what he considers as a requirement and the embrace of what is required through the supply of water direct to home, for which there is a electricity requirement which comes from a centralized grid. It's not generated locally. So you have to pay to the centralized grid whatever comes. And this indeed is the kind of point at which we are actually in a state of affairs where the economy of how this works can only be sustained by having some people who claim their own complete authority over the place, and they do so by participating in this election. So you could say that whoever is the one who has won the auction, they are basically claiming that that village is theirs for that duration of time. Could be 5 years, and how they as well say generate their money and so on is a separate story that for another kind of a reflection on the manner in which what is called as democracy with liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice as the values, when it comes to practice, what it ends up as. So if this is a kind of a story that one finds, and this is an embracing of the method, and we claim that, say, this is indeed good, then we also accept that, say, the kind of way in which we are looking at democracy is that if at all the kind of person that we notice is at the helm of affairs, that person is following the values of our liking, then that is what is the best form of our government. There's a question that Prabhanjana has to ask, so I just take this question as well. So Prabhanjana, what's the point that you want to ask?
Oh, that was mistake.
Yeah, okay. So the key point that I want to bring to your attention is that when it comes to questions of the values that we are to look at and the kind of debate with respect to the values that need to be looked at, as Professor K.C. Bhattacharya has repeatedly pointed out, it has not actually reached the state of affairs where there was indeed a conflict that made people go into sufficient depths to recognize whether what is being stated is properly analyzed before it is embraced. So we've basically taken a number of these factors as is and without questioning. And also, whatever comes with it, we try to make sure that the nature of analysis is such that it embraces and takes it forward. So such is the way in which, say, current polity is functioning. And if at all the desire is to look at Rama Rājya, then some of these questions necessarily have to be opened up. My reason of giving these examples and so on is only to bring to attention the importance of the question. So now, let me get to the question of the Sankarya point, which also is one of the key contentious issues as on today. So one of the points that is actually talked of with respect to any kind of Sankarya, in fact, the manner in which Shastras would speak of, they'd say that both Varna Sankarya as well as Karma Sankarya are to be avoided. That is to say, the sense of, and here Varna is necessarily the same as Jati. And what do I mean by it? It means that, say, Varna is known only by birth. This is a formulation which gets questioned by saying, well, we do have people who are outside the scope of Hindu religion. So how do you as well include them into the nature of our own current formulation? So it is here that the various personal laws that came in, they were indeed, say, meant to ensure in erstwhile eras, to ensure that the nature of how law is operative, it indeed operates in a manner in which, given a particular instance of a case, what appropriately applies to them is what is actually indeed applied. That this system was undermined during the British era itself, and only a logical unfolding of it post-independence meant that it was completely erased, which also led to the point of declaring that in order for us as a country to be strong as a nation, we should have a uniform law that combines the manner in which criminal law as well as civil law of the country that is operative on every citizen is something that is the same. So any person in the country can say, we are all one, we all belong to one nation because we are all ruled by the same law. So this is the kind of idea that is at the core of the embrace of the idea of uniform civil code, which also finds a very important place in the directive principles of state policy. So the key question is, say, if there is a uniform civil code, what shall be the kind of place of these unique kind of inherited practices, customs that people may have? Would they indeed get violated, or certain kind of these practices, would they get abstracted, and then manner in which this formulation shall be taken forward? So you notice that, say, the response to this from the Dharmashastra perspective has been that when it comes to, say, certain kind of a practice which has been in vogue in a certain set of people, so long as it is not harming anyone else around, it be continued. This is a certain kind of a wisdom which captured the manner in which several reigns of this country happened across the board. And the embrace of a uniform civil code is something that still hasn't addressed how would this diversity be captured. And even in this diversity, one clear point that does come in is that since untouchability has already been claimed as a existent reality, or it was an existent reality at some time in the past, in spite of the fact that it has never been properly defined, and it is also elevated to the level of a universal feature. In fact, the use of the term universal, I want to do it in a very strictly philosophical sense. I'll also tell you why it is to be taken in the philosophical sense just in a while. The fact that, say, the formulation comes with the context that there is a practice which has been taken not as a practice which came in the form of, if at all it existed, in the form of a certain kind of a misnomer, but it is inherently present in the very structuring of the way in which this entire Hindu society has been formulated. So any kind of a civil code that actually comes across must ensure that this kind of a practice is to be overcome. So how do you do that? That is where, say, you would find across different states, there might as well be instances of specific kind of political maneuvers that would claim that if you have a scheduled caste girl who happens to marry an upper caste boy, then there is a certain kind of an incentive that the government indeed gives. So much so that we also have a Supreme Court judgment that would say that intercaste, interreligious marriages are to be treated as one of the ways in which secularism can be forwarded. Secularism is something that is better understood when intercaste and interreligious marriages indeed happen. So such is the kind of current law as it is existent. So the formulation of uniform civil code would necessarily be such that the practices which have been called as untouchability, they would never ever be seriously, say, reflected on, because within the Indian past itself, a term for untouchability does not exist in any Indian language before the 20th century Common Era. Many people would say that the word not existent does not mean that it was indeed not existent. But at the same time, the same set of people might also point out that this is a society where the manner in which the words and the kind of meanings that are associated with the words are given great kind of importance, so much so that whatever is actually present in reality can indeed be properly described in language. There are darshanas which actually claim that specific sense, that the nature of reality that is present outside and the kind of descriptors which we have in language, they indeed are possible, and therefore, say, describing reality in language is possible, and we have language to suit that. And the entire effort has been to ensure that this language is bettered over time. How can we accurately describe what is in reality? So you'd find that, say, there are several realist schools in the country of thought, of the philosophy that one would locate, that their entire effort has been how best can we describe the situations in which we are in. And it is in this light that the usage of the sense of universal that I used becomes important, because universal, the technical term that we would refer to it as samanya, and this samanya is one of the 7 padarthas in Vaiseshika Darshana, since Vaiseshika and Nyaya, both these darshanas are stated to be, say, sister darshanas, you find that, say, there's a usage of these terms which actually finds its reference between Nyaya and Vaiseshika. So the sense in which I intend to bring to your attention, the talk about the universal called untouchability. That is something that I do believe requires certain attention, because all the formulation that would indeed get built about the sense of a uniform civil code currently assumes that such a universal is indeed existent. And if it can be shown that it is not a universal, technically as a philosophical formulation. So to give you an example of what a universal means, all the cows in the world must have a common kind of a feature in them, which we can call as cowness, which is present in them, that makes them get identified as a cow. So cowness is the universal which is present in every cow that is there in the world. Cowness and cow. Similarly, one could actually speak about humanness and human beings. One could speak of specifically when it comes to the sense in which one refers to the lionness. So there are ways in which in the Western philosophy, the sense of a universal is taken to be that of a natural kind. Within the Indian darshanas, Buddhists have not accepted the presence of universals, whereas you do find Nyaya Vaiseshikas, Mimamsakas, they accept that there indeed are present some universals. What exactly they mean by the universal, they might get altered, but the sense in which, say, you find the acceptance of this universal is a very important kind of a distinction that one can draw between these two types of darshanas. So there's a Nastika darshana and a Nastika darshana. Now, the key point is that within the Nyaya Vaiseshika, Mimamsa, and those kind of darshanas, they would actually point out that the manner in which the society being divided as Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, these four varnas, they are indeed universals of their own kind. That is to say, there is a universal called Brahmanatva, which is present in all Brahmanas. There is a Kshatriyatva, which is present in all Kshatriyas. Vaishyatva, present in all Vaishyas. Shudratva, present in all Shudras. So this is a kind of formulation within which these have been taken as universals. And this sense of a universal which is being spoken of, it differs from the Western sense in which, say, universal is spoken of in Aristotle or Plato, for one simple reason that there is a clear kind of a relation that is pointed out between the universal and particular when it comes to Indian darshanas. So what do they say? They say that there is a relation called samavaya, which is inherence, that is present between a universal and a particular. That is to say, it is the universal. Every particular has the universal of that particular in it. So this inherence is a specific relation that has been described and that has been taken to be a very important kind of a structure to understand the nature of reality that we have. Now, this sense of inherence relation which is present, let me take a contrast to the sense of a universal, because there are some other universals which are called as pseudo-universals. So in terms of the specific term used in Nyaya Vaiseshika, we call them as upadhi. So jati or samanya is a universal, and you have a contrast which is pseudo-universal, which is a upadhi. Now, there is a distinction drawn between these two, which has been one of the very important intellectual exercises that one finds from amongst the scholars. Udayanacharya, one of the great Kashmiri Nayayika, who is also stated to be the precursor to the Navya formulation in the country, he makes a very important distinction between upadhi and jati, and says that upadhis have what he calls as jati badhakas. There are 6 such, say, technical conditions which would distinguish a jati from an upadhi. Let me give an example of upadhi for you to get a broad idea. In this particular lecture, I would not be able to say great details, but I do want to give sufficient idea about what this distinction is and connect it to our discussion on caste untouchability and sankarya, varna sankarya, and intermixing caused by intercaste, interreligious marriages. So this is the focus that I intend to bring to, but before that, a brief kind of understanding about these principles which are at work. So, for example, if you take a term like tallness, tallness is certainly different from the sense in which cowness is, because tallness specifically does not have a specific way in which you say it is applicable only to a certain kind of a being. One can talk about tall cows, tall human beings, tall horses. You can actually take the idea of tallness and apply it to any kind of a grouping of beings, and correspondingly one can order them in the manner of this function that the sense of tallness gives you. So there's a measure by which one can say what is tall, what is not. There's a definition, and that can be applied, and thereby say there's a corresponding kind of approach by which one can sort whatever are given. So in this formulation, the sense of tallness as contrasted with a jati like cowness, the kind of distinctions between these two can be observed by noticing that one of the features that one has and the other does not, one of these jati badhakas, is the term called sankarya. So when one refers to, say, the technical sense by which one can understand sankarya, so this is a very important condition that one does come across. So I'm actually pointing you to a specific study that was done a few years ago as a PhD thesis on a study of universals, wherein there is a broad kind of outline given about universals and their contrast with, say, what are called as pseudo-universals. So within the context of these pseudo-universals, please notice the term sankarya here. One of the 6 jati badhakas is a term called sankarya. And if one were to understand, say, sankara, sankarya as a notion, then in a technically rigorous sense, it is this sense that requires to be properly understood. So what does a sankarya mean? There are, if there are 2 generalizing characters, the sphere of one of which crosses that of the other, such characters will not constitute a universal. So this is fairly, say, broad, but there are, say, quite a few examples and also its applications. So there's also a specific reference here. Sankarascha Paraspara Atyanta Abhava Samanadhikaranyayor Ekatra Samaveshaha. So Samanadhikaranya, or say Dharmayor Ekatra Samaveshaha, such a thing is what you call as Sankara. So now this is something that requires a different explanation, a greater explanation, but I would get back to say our specific question in this context of understanding the manner in which Uniform Civil Code brought under the context of the belief that untouchability happens to be a universal. So if it were to be a universal, one of the key features that it ought to have, as against that of let's say the manner in which one notices pseudo-universal or an upadhi, then it should be the case that one cannot have any person declared as an untouchable by any means, except for the kind of birth that the person has. So this is one kind of a formulation. So we have actually tried to point out in the case of Shambhuka Vadha that the kind of way in which Rama goes about the act of punishing Shambhuka, that law which is operative, it is the same that is operative also on Trishanku, who, when he expressed the same desire as that of Shambhuka, who is a Shudra, to perform a yajna, such that that yajna which is performed is to ensure that with the body, physical body, one rises to the world of Swarga. That to Swargaloka, that is a formulation which is not acceptable to Shastras, and the kind of thing that Vasishta curses Trishanku is that he become a Chandala for the kind of idea of pursuing with this Ashastriya Vancha, a desire which is not Shastriya, not as per Shastras, the manner in which this can indeed be pushed forth in such a manner that one can come to a state where the fact that, say, Trishanku pushed it meant that, say, he was cursed to become a Chandala. And Chandala is one of the Asprasyas. The only Asprasya that one finds from within the Shastras turns out to be a Chandala. So now we are talking about Asprasyata or Asprasyatva, which are the universals that are supposedly present in the Asprasya called Chandala. So the key question now to understand is whether it is indeed the case that Trishanku, if he as a Kshatriya can be cursed to become a Chandala, then the sphere of who indeed would be a Chandala or an Asprasya, it has now been added on by someone who is born a Kshatriya. So this violates the condition that you cannot have two different senses. That is, say, you cannot have, let me read out the exact, Sankarya statement. If there are two generalizing characters, the sphere of one of which crosses that of the other, such characters will not constitute a universal. So if at all the sense of this Asprasya is something that is to be universal, then it indeed has to be that there cannot be a sense beyond this formulation that cannot go beyond the sense of anyone else becoming an Asprasya. If that is completely ruled out, then indeed it becomes a universal, which is not the case in this instance, nor can it be the case within the case of Trishanku himself, because we have Devi Bhagavatam, which would indicate that with the blessing of the kind of sadhana that Trishanku does, he indeed is revived to become the Raja again, and his son happens to be Harishchandra, the great Satya Harishchandra, whose tale we repeatedly hear. So within Raghuvamsa itself, we have a story that is very insightful to be kept in mind. And the question of this Sankarya that is spoken of, in this instance, as applicable to that of the creation of Asprasyata or Asprasyatva as a universal, is something that is a fairly recent phenomena. So in fact, this is a point that is only argued historically, but never argued in terms of the philosophy behind the same, which is what makes it all the more interesting and important to be seriously analyzed. The point remains that within the scope of Dr. Ambedkar's analysis himself, he would say that Manusmriti, in spite of indicating a certain kind of dislike towards Chandala, and the sense of this dislike is also very specific, because there is an order that Manusmriti specifies, which says that the nature of how those kind of marriages which are acceptable and those kind of marriages which are not acceptable, and those kind of marriages which are desired and to be, in place, and those kind of things which can be ordered and those which cannot be ordered. So these are the frameworks, and the entire Smriti would actually speak of, because it's speaking about a manner in which one can indeed say, look at the possible spaces that can happen. You have an entire section which analyzes this. So the definition that Manusmriti would give for a Chandala or an Asprasya, as found from the Smriti, where there's a proper kind of a definition and a connotation that is given, it is that when a Brahmana Kanya weds a Shudra, who is the Shudravara, the kind of progeny between these two is called a Chandala. And there are no specific dharmas which are actually, given to them. And when we refer to dharma, the reference to dharma would mean that kind of an activity that indeed has an invocation of Paraloka, not in the sense in which, Prasanna Navjyoti spoke of, but a specific sense in which, they performing a ritual which is ordained by Veda or a Smriti. So this is the sense in which this distinction comes about. So the question that we are looking at is, if at all the sense in which we accept the Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra as universals, as taken in certain tradition within, Indian fold, amongst which, even amongst Hindus today, there are wide-ranging confusions about this specific question. But for amongst those people who indeed believe it to be so, for them, the sense of intermixing, that is the sense of Sankarya, is as good as saying that the universal to which they belong to is actually being, erased, and it is embracing something for which there is no clear path forward that is defined with respect to what dharma would be. So, for those who are actually with the conscious memory of this, they would indeed recognize what is the kind of a conflict that arises when it comes to this non-acceptance of the universality of the specific varnas as a jati, and jati taken as a universal, that is. So, if indeed, going by the principles of modern polity, liberty, equality, fraternity, if it were so taken that the kind of belief system within which each grouping of people or each individual can indeed possess, if they were to be such that they are not to be forced on by the state this way or that, then such a kind of a scenario does not exist with the current constitution of India. So even if the sense of liberty, equality, fraternity are taken to be say the values within which we are actually say working, the kind of exceptions that are actually added on to the nature of what is present in the Constitution of India, they are all taken to be present, which are historically situated and correspondingly with respect to the nature of the history that is accorded. The kind of values have been embedded into the current text of the Constitution. The only way in which this can actually be understood would be first asking whether the past which the history indeed intends to describe, whether such a description holds water on rigorous kind of rigorous kind of scrutiny. And one kind of scrutiny could as well be to claim that the entire past has been oppressed because of the kind of activities or actions performed by one set of people over the other, and say that this has been so since times immemorial. Within the framework of the modern historical frameworks itself, such a thing does not sit well. Because if indeed such a kind of oppression were true, then one would indeed find that, say, the historical method would itself call for a certain kind of challenging of the same. Here are indeed certain kind of choices that are made about what one intends to think of, what is the sense of past that we intend to carry from here on further. And it is that which is actually operative inherently in terms of the decisions about what we think of what future ought to be. So the choices that are made, they are not innocent choices. They are deeply pregnant with political choices, which are in fact political directions, which when chosen on one side, it would indeed mean that other possibilities are completely closed. So even if we assume that, say, there has been a point in the past where, say, some choices have been made, there is no necessary kind of a point that even to this day, as of now, we make a choice without critical scrutiny about what are the ideas as also the nature of sense of past which is actually at play when certain choices are made. So it is for that one indeed has to open this question up to ask and put it in the framework of a certain acceptable, rational grounding, wherein there can be a discussion that can open up spaces in such a manner that people might as well belong to whichever group that they are, and they might as well come up with their own respective belief systems. But the nature of the maryada that calls for a discussion between these two people ought to be such that the nature of belief systems which are present, they are indeed respected. So how does one indeed bring about this kind of a respectful interaction is a question which cannot happen till we are ready to open up those things which are also considered as taken for granted. And it is in this that I do want to make a very important and probably a strong point here, that within the Constitution of India, so long as there is a historically situated imagination that there has been something called as untouchability as a universal in the entire past, or whatever is the set of past which is being tried to be overcome by way of the changes which have been made through the post-independent era, then the possibility of thinking about Rama Rājya itself, in the sense in which Rama Rājya has been understood and the memories of it are preserved in terms of the inherited senses that we are currently having, that cannot ever have a proper public space hearing, nor would it have a created space where one can indeed think of a manner where one can talk about it and reflect on it to think of where indeed we intend to move further in future. So it is for that reason that one must, when thinking of, say, like our Prime Minister would like to say, that there is a new India that is being desired. That new India, if it has to think about the fundamentals on which we are standing, and some of the fundamentals may not be strong also, then we do have an opportunity and an option to try and say dig deep, and also try to, with the benefit of some things which are learned in retrospect, start talking of them. I'd like to bring your attention to a very fine article which was written fairly recently in the 21st century Common Era. In 2003, Dharampalji was reflecting on the question of Asprasyata, and he wrote a fine article. I was surprised that he was actually reflecting on that, and I felt that I would have been really happy if I read that article when I happened to meet him and then discussed it, but that did not happen. But let me summarize that article for you. Those of you who are comfortable reading Hindi, I can share that article as well. So what does he say within that is that he asks a question. Let us assume that, say, Asprasyata as understood right now. And there's, of course, a whole lot of things which happened during the British times, where some of the kind of practices have been essentialized in manners in which they were not true of the nature of how society itself was operative. But even if we accept that, say, there is indeed a kind of a case where, irrespective of the foreign rule, there are certain practices which have been present throughout, even prior to that also. Then also, let us say that there is a perspective from which Brahmanas looked at the rest of the castes as such. They might as well start by saying, we are the Bhusuras, we are the ones who are the rulers of the world, and such may be the kind of standpoint from which a Brahmana might look at the world. So, Dharampalji asked a question, what would actually be the self-image of those who are currently called as scheduled castes, or those who are called as untouchables, and those who have been termed under the, brought under the fold of Harijans by Mahatma Gandhi, and later as Dalits by Dr. Ambedkar. What indeed was their own ancestors' self-image about their place in the society? So that was a question that he felt is important to be studied, because we do not have, say, many such studies that indeed talk about it. And there is indeed a case made when you find that a person like Sri D.R. Nagaraj, when he actually reflected on some of the Jati Puranas, he started bringing them out and saying that each of these Jatis, they actually start with their own kind of a story of origins. So one would find a story of origins of caste, which is called as Madiga, where in their Jati Purana, they'll also point out that how their own presence is actually at the core of the formation of the universe. And they are the ones who actually lead it. So the very fact that, say, one has a number of these Kula Puranas, Jati Puranas, which are still, say, present and being preserved by some people in different parts of the country, indicates that if there indeed was a case where there was an oppression, as understood in modern terms itself, there indeed was a counter to it also present from within that tradition, and that has a scope for its own kind of a dynamic. So when such a thing is present, and it is indeed present, then should it be the case that all these be set aside and they embrace a completely different formulation which gives a certain identity based on certain formulations which may not connect them with their own past, but a new story is to be written. Naye daur mein likhenge hum milkar nayi kahani. So this was the kind of a question that D.R. Nagaraj says that Dr. Ambedkar did not foresee in his embrace of modern polity and modernity, and his own formulation about, say, untouchables and depressed classes as being suppressed throughout their course of the past. that these spaces and these discussions are also happening would call for our own current understanding to start looking at whether the manner in which we place the nature of law that is operative, should it indeed focus itself on certain peculiar kind of version of past which animated some of these discussions? And if in such an instance, how does one end up moving further where one can stop, say, the influence of a sense of being not in a state of Swarajin ideas. And even here, for these ideas to actually find a place in common discussion in current times, it may take a lot of time. But the fact that, say, these questions are to be posed becomes an important point in itself. And there is a whole degree of space to reflect on that requires these to be brought to the fore. And it is in this light that there's a suggestion also being made that when one has to talk about the sense of intermixing and also place it in a framework of analysis, we need to as well say take the kind of strength from the understanding of universals that Nayayikas like Udayanacharya have spoken of, and the manner in which they have contrasted it with Upadhi, which is a pseudo-universal, and how, say, Sankarya happens to be a very critical point that distinguishes a jati from an Upadhi, from amongst the various kinds of jati badhakas that we indeed have. Why does this become important? If you happen to read Annihilation of Caste, I prefer Annihilation of Caste because of, let's say, the Indian pronunciation for the same. The key point is that there is a specific reference about the nature of debates between Buddhist and Nyaya Vaiseshikas, which are also discussed as part of the Annihilation of Caste, because these, the point that Dr. Ambedkar was making was too radical for him also to actually stand by it. So he was trying to make an effort by looking through all the various channels before he made that bold claim that caste must be annihilated. But that does not mean that, say, that has to be the final word, because it requires further debate, and it is still, say, a point from where debate begins, but it's not the end of the debate. It is for that reason that I wanted to bring these points to your attention, and they directly have a role to play in terms of understanding the way in which Rāma Rājya is understood today, specifically by taking the examples of the injustices that Rama is purported to have committed according to the modern people, which would include the kind of decisions that he had to take against Sita, against Vali, and against Shambhuka. So these are, say, critical case studies which are actually asserted as instances of injustices according to the modern perspective. And that would indeed call for a reflection on where does this modern perspective place itself when one is being assessed based on certain values, because in a kind of a debate, we do expect that, say, one value is being adjudged based on another value. And then again, you try and see where can be common values that one can as well, say, find to be present. And over and above that, see which are the kind of things that can be accepted and which not. And even after such a kind of a distinction is made, there would still be people who would say we will hold on to our own kind of a belief system. So what would be the kind of place that is to be given to those who hold on to such a system? This is not a new story that happened, because when one talks about the kind of debates that happened between Buddhism and Nayayikas or Mimamsakas, or for that matter, between, say, Nayayikas, Mimamsakas, there's a whole lot of debating that did happen, all with respect to how one indeed has to understand reality and in fact whether there is reality or not itself. And in all these debates, never was it claimed that a particular darshana or a particular mata has ever been defeated. It is actually stated that the mati, that the mind of the person who is actually debating based on a particular kind of a stance, it is only he or she that gets defeated. If at all there was a debate between Nayayika and a Buddhist, it only means that, say, if Nayayikas have won a particular debate, it means that that particular Nayayika has won that. That does not defeat the entire Buddhist thought itself. Because even after that debate is done, this Nayayika, whenever he has to point out has to state his own Siddhanta, he would have to actually ask what would be the kind of thing that a Buddhist would say, and then clarify to that to clarify his own position of the same. These are thoughts which actually have a different sense of how the reality itself is understood, because of which one would indeed say that the sense of a defeat in any debate was only with respect to the mati, not the mata. So if this is, and this is not just the case between, say, Astika matas, it is also between Astika and Nastika. In such a scenario, the manner in which the polity, which actually has all these, must place itself would be such that, and if it has to be such that, it does not cause, as I pointed out in the beginning, nayasya kuta kapatam namaya nacha matsaraha vishaye bhumipalasya tasya dharma sanatanaha. If at all it indeed comes to a stage where each one does not have kuta, kapata, maya or matsara against the other, and each has a flourishing space within a Rajya, then such a kind of a thing could possibly be stated to be something that is close to Rama Rājya for our times. That is a possibility. And whether the current kind of a structure in which we are placed, whether it offers it, I'm afraid it is a big no. And that comes mostly because our own sense of past does not actually capture some of these ideas and debates in terms of the kind of thought and the philosophy that is behind it. And today, of course, there are some efforts in that light of trying to understand this philosophy that are being made. There are, of course, say, certain types of analysis which I've done. There's a recent work of Professor Gopal Guru and Professor Sundar Sarukkai, who have written a very fine book for debate called Cracked Mirror, in which there's an analysis of phenomenology of untouchability by Professor Sundar Sarukkai, and Professor Gopal Guru tries to speak of his own particular experience as a Dalit, and in what manner he sees, say, a way forward. And these kind of discussions are happening in manners in which they already assume that within the scope of, let's say, Advaita, like Professor Ramchandra Gandhi has pointed out, that the shame of Advaita is untouchability. Now, this kind of a thing is not philosophical in its approach. It is rather, say, a conflation, or rather a sankarya, bhava sankarya, intermixing between historical approach and philosophical approach. And that kind of a sankarya is not going to give us clarity. One of the things that one finds as a specific reference throughout all Shastras is that sankarya is to be avoided, because such a thing creates great degree of confusion, from where it becomes all the more difficult for one to get over. It is in that light that for one to actually place ourselves more concretely in one way or the other, it would call for us to go back to the very origins from where the manner in which our own construction begins, for which one should indeed say, what is the construction of the origins of the world that we are living in? How does it alter from one to another? And that is when there will be some tough questions that will be posed. Whenever there are claims to be made that say, these kind of things are the kind of benefits which are offered by modern science, which has a different kind of an ontology or the manner in which, say, the story of origins is concerned. But even there, the claims are disputable, and that is precisely where the opening for further engagement also comes in. But how does one do that with mutual respect is a key question that also needs to be asked, and it must indeed be addressed. There are many more points that can actually be raised within the kind of points that I tried raising. And also, before ending this, I also want to point out that there is a specific point that also is spoken of within the sense of the points that Bhishmacharya stated in this 57th Adhyaya of Shanti Parva. He says, Rajanam pradhamam vindet tato bharyam tato dhanam rajanyasati lokasya kuto bharya kuto dhanam. There's a specific praise of the importance of Raja that is being spoken of in this. And the reference is that if at all one intends to ensure that one is protected, one needs to have a Raja first. There is somebody who takes ownership of whatever happens. And when such a kind of an ownership does indeed come in, it is then that one can as well have a wife, or say accumulate wealth and enjoy it. Currently speaking, if one indeed observes carefully, the kind of ownership that democracies allow for the kind of leadership that comes in is indeed something that is limited. In fact, they would praise that, say, such a kind of lack of ownership is the strength of democracy as well, because it is stated that we indeed would like to develop a sense of collective ownership. And whether such a thing is indeed possible or not, that is, of course, something that I wouldn't want to say assert right away, but I would leave it as a question, because when somebody does not take ownership of all the actions that are happening, then who is the one who actually can be blamed for some things? So if at all there is a kind of disaster that happens in Uttarakhand, Chamoli region because of human action, it would still be passed off as a natural disaster, which is out of the control of human beings. Whereas the human beings concerned, even if they are conscious or if they are knowledgeable of the kind of damage that happens, because there are, say, immediate concerns of the kind of business that it generates and also the kind of employment that it can generate for people. So some things can also be given a pass. So in that sense, there is no concrete ground on which one can ever try to assert that anyone would take ownership of anything at all. And in such a scenario, what we would probably have is actually a sense of anarchy. And India has, at one point, has been famously called as a functioning anarchy. And it is functioning because maybe at some point, like this person who has chosen to pay 25 lakhs and then say, ensure that the dues to the electricity department are paid so that villages continue to have panchayat supply of water, even if the people cannot pay enough bills, electricity bills, so that this kind of supply be continued. You'll have someone who comes and says, for the sake of my own enjoyment of power for 5 years, I intend to spend that amount. And how would he actually end up generating that money? Well, if he is actually a really good person, then he would probably end up spending all his money and burning his hands. And there are several stories in post-independent India where several rich people have entered politics with an intent of trying to help people, and given the kind of framework they are in, they end up spending all their wealth and end up as paupers in the end. And there's another contrast also. There are those who actually think that, say, this association with position in power is something that can be leveraged to try and create more and more business opportunities, which could indeed include, say, exploitation of nature in manners in which that clearly violate whatever are the existent laws, but yet it's something that has to be done because without which, say, the show would not go on. So for the show to go on, some things are required, and how much are we ready to accept to let the show go on is a conscious question that comes to play. Only when one is ready to, say, make some fundamental questions get posed in public, and there's a due debate amongst sufficient kind of a let's say a focus group which would have to, say, increase into some substantive size for it to actually make some sense. But for all that, if at all a desire for a Rama Rājya can act as a kind of a ground, then nothing like it. So it is with these words that I'd like to stop for today. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to take them. So, Acharya?
Namaste.
Namaste.
Are you hearing clearly?
Yeah, you're very audible.
Okay. I did not attend the last 2 weeks sessions due to my own preoccupation with other things.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems that I have missed so many things in between. The issue is very dear to my heart and mind.
We do have the recordings.
Yes, I certainly I will enjoy it, and because it is my intention to understand the nature of Varna, Jati, and caste, the different notions about these things discussed in the various new disciplines, which I have not yet seen. Okay. Apart from those things, today I joined at the end of the session, but then there was discussion was already over about the annihilation of caste and the similarities between the Buddhist and Nayayika's battle and the Ambedkar's battles between these castes.
Mm-hmm.
Something that what I understand is that you are discussing about the Sankarya and pseudo Upadhi and pseudo Jati, something like that. When
pseudo universal and universals.
Pseudo universal and universal. And you brought the similarity between this Nayayika and Buddhist rivalry and the present day Indian situation. This is, I think.
I mean, I only tried to hint that, say, one needs to look at it in that long-term scape. Yes.
But I don't think it is something workable, or it is not. It is related to the. It can be related to the present scenario. The Nayayika's notion of jati and Buddhist notion of jati or apoha, something very different, and I don't think that it applies here. That is my contention.
Okay.
And I will discuss it with you later on, because I did not know how you brought those rivalries and to the present situation. That I did not understand because I joined at the fag end of your lecture today also.
Oh, as in, I was, in fact, we haven't been able to read through the Annihilation of Caste, though I gave a brief of what is the argument which is made in Annihilation of Caste in my last class. But key point that I wanted to bring out is that this distinction between, say, Buddhist and the Nayayikas, or say those who are Vaidikas, this point was actually made long ago by Sir Muhammad Iqbal when speaking about the manner in which, say, the post-independent India can pan out when one takes into account the atheistic socialism of Pandit Nehru, and how would it sit well with Varnashrama Dharma of the Brahmanism. So this is a question that he felt was going to play out, and this was something that he writes in 1938 in a letter to 1937 in a letter to Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So some of these questions that currently that I am talking, and the embrace of Dr. Ambedkar of Buddhism, they were not things which happened in isolation. They happened in manners in which, say, there was some kind of appropriation of an earlier kind of a debate that happened, and whether that debate was properly captured or not is a separate story. One did not actually make an effort to capture the entire debate properly, because if that were there, then it would still be placed in that context. But it was taken out of that context and placed it in the social context of post-independent era and how we need to imagine social polity of modern times. So it is because of that that, say, for one to get clarity about where we have to place, I do think that, say, going back to those points is important. And when intercaste marriages are what are suggested by Dr. Ambedkar as the way forward for Hindu society to embrace the liberal values of liberty, equality, to move towards an egalitarian society, then that indeed has to come to a question of understanding where Sankarya is a conflict point. For that to be understood, to have a proper understanding about Sankarya itself is necessary, which is where I refer to the Jati Upadhi contrast.
But I don't think that is the case here. Even if some Brahman man marries a Dalita or whatever other woman, nothing Sankarya that happens, and nothing will happen. That is what either they become Brahmin or they become they go to the other caste. Something like that happens here. So Dharma Shastras, they have some different. They have a very trodden path here. They are very definite. That means they are not in a dilemma in that case, either way or whatever way. So, and I agree with the Ambedkar's ideas of egalitarian society and the opportunities to all the people. Still, we need to understand what he has to say about the annihilation of caste, and his embrace of Buddhism is partly because of some of the lack of knowledge of what Buddha really told, or something like that. There is a fair chance of such.
So he actually had, therefore he modified Buddha also.
He thought there is a no caste in Buddhism and something like that. But if we don't see the Buddha's own words, then no such thing seems to be the story of Buddha. Though in the Tibetan Buddhism or whatever the Theravada or later versions, whatever may be the situation, but it is not the standpoint of Buddha.
Which is precisely why Ambedkar went on to write a book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, where he himself has brought in from his reading of Buddha, how it translates to the social polity that he is intending to construct. There's a book by him called The Buddha and His Dhamma.
And I also thinking that we should bring a Buddha and his dharma, one version. What Buddha has to say about what is dharma and what is not dharma.
In fact, we indeed have, say, a work which was done by Professor S.R. Boyle, which exclusively tried to point out what are the flaws that Dr. Ambedkar has when he actually wrote his Buddha and his Dhamma. So there is a work which is of this kind which is present, but none of these academic work operates when it comes to, say, the Ambedkarites who are actually following religion which Dr. Ambedkar has proposed, which is the Buddha and his Dhamma.
That is right.
So now we are no longer in the space of the realm of debate with another person who is also a scholar. We are talking about a prophet, and when the prophet is in place, then the question would be the prophet's word is the word of God. So it is from that standpoint that requires to be understood.
Yes, yes.
The key question is more than this point about what is the debate between these different perspectives. What matters is actually what is the kind of framework within which these debates can actually have a fruitful engagement. It is not about, say, whether the debates are taking it to shape the nature of polity, but the polity itself has to give a framework within which each has a scope for its own further development. And it is here that, say, the nature of the framework is what would actually give us a talk about how we can think of, given the conscious knowledge of these questions that are there, what would be that kind of a platform or that kind of a framework within which all these debates can have a manner in which they can still happen, yet without harming the specific interests of each group which might have a different belief system. So clearly, say, if Supreme Court of India would say that intercaste or interreligious marriages are a reference to secularism, and secularism is a value of the Constitution of India, then there is indeed a kind of conflict that comes with those people who believe that, say, intercaste and interreligious marriages are to be avoided. So there is a specific political question in terms of the nature of polity that we are present in and the space within which these debates happen that is to be addressed.
It's fantastic, sir.
So I hope we'll have more occasions to further go into greater detail on these points, including, say, what Dr. Ambedkar had to say about how Plato's understanding of universals has been, say, destroyed by Aristotelian formulation, and how he sees that is something that easily addresses whatever are the current arguments about Brahmanatva as understood by as Jati. So there's an entire chapter on this within Annihilation of Caste. I could share those details.
That is okay. That is okay, but there is no similarities between the Brahmanatva Jati, the present caste system, and the Nayayika's caste system. That is what I wanted to point. Totally different. The debate between the Buddhas and Nayayikas is about whether there is Ghatatva or not.
Right.
It is not about the Brahmanatva, Kshatriyatva, or Shudratva. That is the point.
True. That is true. So, because there is an even more fundamental question, but I am saying that because it has been socialized, once this Dr. Ambedkar's formulation came in, to pick those threads is equally important.
Did Ambedkar speak about this Sankarya, etc.?
In fact, he has actually been referring
this
to
Sankarya of what earlier Buddhist philosophers wrote. That Ambedkar was referring
not specifically in that sense, no. But he did speak of universals, and
that is a totally wrong notion. That is, it is not about the universals. The present Brahmanatva is not something, it cannot be called universal or something like that. Because for a property that to be called as a universal, there should be some common property to grasp the the basic sense of that universal. If we say there is one partness universal, then all parts should be, we should be able to grasp all the parts. When we see a part, then immediately we recognize it is a part and recognize it a part. And partness is also recognized immediately. That thing that does not happen in the Brahmanatva, Kshatriyatva, etc. If we say the who is Brahmana, who is not Brahmana, something like that does not happen here.
That is precisely why I say the point is shifted on to whether the parents are, both parents are Brahmanas or not, both parents are Kshatriyas or not. This question comes in.
Yes. But that's why I am pointing that this Brahmanatva, etc. are not equal to the Ghatatva, etc. These are different kinds.
Yes.
They are not in the realm of Nayayikas and Buddhists.
No, I think that say when it comes to the question of universals, indeed these discussions also happened, and there are say references that one can show where Brahmanatva as a jati has been defended by Nayayikas. So
then I can say that certainly they are also misled there.
Okay, so then say that would lead us to a separate discussion altogether. So
yes,
we look forward to that.
That's what I wanted to point.
Okay.
We'll say later on we will discuss. Tomorrow I will join anyhow. Okay.
So let's end this with a short prayer. Apadam apahartaram dataram sarvasampadam lokabhiramam Sri Ramam Puyo Puyo Namamyaham. Tomorrow we shall as well continue the discussion on Sanatana as Nityanutana, and let's see where all we can take this discussion to. Thank you.